Welcome. I'm Dr. Owen Anderson, and I'm going to continue some work I've been doing on understanding the decolonizing the curriculum movement. Today, we're going to turn to a talk on YouTube that was a presentation at Villanova and the opening remarks by Dr. Padilla Peralta. So I have a few places in here where we're going to listen to him give his own remarks and his own understanding of what he means by decolonizing the curriculum. And then I've tried to type down some of the other spots, the ones we'll listen to, and some other ones as well, to get a sense of what's going on. What does this mean to decolonize the curriculum? What exactly are people being asked to do? So the first segment starts here at around minute 3.
Faculty meeting, the town hall was one that I chose not to attend, although I received regular text updates from people who did, because I felt at the end of the day that faculty town halls like this were precisely the kinds of staging grounds for the declaration of a renewed commitment to the predominantly white ethos of this institution that I did not want to witness firsthand.
So what he's talking about is that there'd been some controversy at Princeton, where he's a professor, and he and some others had written a letter about decolonizing, and then they were met with some arguments back. So there was going to be a town hall meeting about this debate, and he decided not to attend because he didn't want to hear the other side's presentation of what he thought would just be more white supremacy at Princeton. Princeton being predominantly, according to him, predominantly white institution. So let's go ahead and see what did he want to hear about.
Here, the question that I have repeatedly voiced in conversations with some of my colleagues is really at its core this: how can I communicate to you? How can I communicate to you persuasively that authoritarianism is here, that it has been here, and that the work of racial capitalism has deprived many of us of any opportunity whatsoever to even think about the exercise of these freedoms that you prize. And that furthermore, if there is something emancipatory that comes from the subjection to these circuits of racial capitalism, it is that we have a much better critique of what it means to wield knowledge and speech responsibly than you do. And that critique is the one that you should be seeking to cultivate instead of bellyaching about the presumptive loss of your right to free speech and unfettered free speech that you have wielded to tremendous harm.
Now, that starts out as a question. I'm going to treat it as a statement, though, because I don't know if he meant it as a question. It's a very long question. But it gives us a whole framework. And I typed it down. I'll switch over to my Google Doc in a moment because I think it gives a good breakdown of what he's thinking. And his field is classics. But I think there's a lot of overlap with my own fields, which are philosophy and religious studies. I mean, I assign a number of the classics, but for him, classics means more not just going through the history of ideas, but you'd know the languages, the original languages and cultural settings. So I'm not suggesting that classics and philosophy are the same thing, just that there's some overlap. And so it's instructive for me to find out what persons mean in classics about decolonizing to see if it then translates over into philosophy. So before we look at the transcript, and you saw there's a little bit of lag sometimes on his side, and I tried to listen as carefully as I could at those times to get down what he was saying. Let me give you one more section here where he talks about what he wants out of decolonizing.
Based classics. In the context of the multicultural 21st century university, there's a tendency to showcase these acts of receiving and negotiating traditions that were previously demarcated and delineated as Euro-American Western civilizational ones, as the kinds of traditions in which folks of color can see themselves as active interlocutors. And so to this end, you usually have classes that are set up such that they move from, say, Sophocles' Antigone to the reception of Antigone either in Africa or the African diaspora, or in Caribbean context, or in North America, so on and so forth. But what Andujar challenges us in terming this happy-face classics is to entertain the proposition that these modes of reception are being presented as a way of duping folks into participating in their own subjection. And that this is something that we must avoid at all costs, not only because at the end of the day, these actions serve simply to reify and reconsolidate the hegemony of a predominantly white lens, but also because they inhibit the work of epistemic justice that would be necessary for the radical emancipatory project that would be required as a precondition of seeing through decolonization successfully. This also means...
there he's describing his own circumstances where people might kind of they try to infuse diversity by having maybe a reading like Antigone, and then looking at the ways Antigone was received in other cultures and say, look, we are studying other cultures. So he's going to suggest that that kind of diversity is not what he's talking about. It's not going to produce the kind of justice and redistribution that he's looking for. So let me switch over here now and go through a few readings with you. So here's that first one. How can I communicate to you? How can I communicate to you? How can I communicate persuasively that authoritarianism is here, that it has been here, and that the work of racial capitalism has deprived many of us of any opportunity whatsoever to even think about the exercise of these freedoms you prize, and that furthermore, if there is something emancipatory that comes from the discussion of racial capitalism, it is that we have a much better critique of what it means to wield freedom of speech responsibly than you do. And that critique is the one that you should be seeking to cultivate instead of bellyaching about the presumptive loss of your right to free speech that you've wielded to tremendous harm. So again, that's actually a question mark. We should end here with a question mark. I'm treating it as a statement. I want to communicate these things to you. So think about what that means. One, he wants to communicate. Two, by reason, to persuade. Right? So he's entering into the realm of reason. He's arguing with other people. He's presenting them with a case, and he wants them to agree to what he has to say. And that is that authoritarianism is here and has been here. And that the work of racial capitalism has deprived many of any opportunity whatsoever to use the freedoms that some people might complain about losing, which he used the word bellyache. And that we have a better critique than you do. You should cultivate our critique instead of bellyaching about your freedoms. You have used freedoms to great harm. All right, so roughly 7 points here you could break it down to, but notice what's going on. I think this is a key. He's arguing, using reason to form an argument. And once you do that, there are laws of argument that's called logic, and there are laws of reason called the laws of thought. So we can evaluate that invites all of us into the discussion, right? One of the words he uses, into the discussion, it invites all of us to evaluate his claims. They're not neutral claims that you just have to accept on his authority. That would be authoritarianism, wouldn't it? No, we learn about and evaluate his authority. Now, I don't know if he's going to want to back up and say even logic, even the laws of reason are colonial, because then why is he trying to communicate and use reason or to persuade anybody, right? What do you persuade people with then if you're not giving arguments? So that seems to be a self-referential absurdity. You use reason, you use logic to then reject reason and logic. Now, what's authoritarianism he's speaking about here? We might get a more clear picture down as we're going, but we can kind of see what it is here. The authoritarianism of a culture with values. And his concern is that those values are largely racial, and that's going to be a term that's hard to define. Does it mean skin color? Not always. It might come down to just meaning being part of the culture. You're either part of it or you're not, depending on if you accept its assumptions. Its beliefs and values. And then also third here, what's it going with this? A culture with values, and you're a part of it if you accept its values, and you're not a part of it insofar as you don't accept it. Oh, yeah. And he's especially focusing in on one part of natural evil, namely strife between humans. So he might say, well, but the way a culture is set up is just not fair. He has his book out is about being an immigrant and how he went from being I think it's called undocumented, it is, And he was an undocumented immigrant in New York, and he went all the way up to become a graduate at Princeton University in classics. I think he did the salutatorian speech at his graduation in Latin, and now he's a professor there. This is great. I mean, people love those kinds of stories. And so he's talking about that and seeing how hard it is to get into another culture, to become accepted. People don't like each other. There's strife. Yeah, that's true. That's part of natural evil in the world. There's strife, which can turn into war. There's famines. There's toil, which can turn into famines. There's sickness, which turns into plagues. And over all of them marching down a path to death. Yeah, it's terrible. Why is there strife in the world? Where did it come from? What's its origin? Why is it still around? And what can we do about it? But he's narrowing it to a specific kind of strife, racial capitalism. And again, that word racial being somewhat hard to define. Does that specifically mean a way of speaking, a physical appearance of some kind? I mean, for any such instance, you could prove a counterexample of someone who had those appearances and was in the group. So what exactly is it? Well, we can call it the big thing. The big thing is strife. People don't like each other. They're mean to each other. They don't love their neighbor. They hate their neighbor. And so you can relate to saying, yeah, I want to figure that out. Question, will you figure that out if you haven't yet figured out moral evil? Natural evil is only one part of moral evil. So then point 4 here, racial capitalism, which has deprived many of any opportunities whatsoever to use these freedoms. Well, it depends, right? I mean, in his case, he did very well for himself. So he might say, yeah, I'm the exception. And there's lots of exceptions like that. People who did very well for themselves and the rest of their group, however you decide to define it, maybe aren't doing as well and they need to do better. So the idea here is that the game is rigged, so to speak. There are rules in place that certain types of people can't get ahead. Depends what get ahead means. And this is part of what we see not addressed by him. Maybe he does somewhere else. I'm not saying he never has in his whole life, but in this segment, we see him focus on strife, but we don't see him focus on the good. Can you be deprived of the good? Can this be an opportunity taken from you or only given up by yourself? You can't lose the good. The good is the knowledge of God revealed through the works of God. Is available to anybody, from the highest to the lowest person. They can and are able to know God. So what are the freedoms? And mostly this turns out to probably be economic freedoms, capitalism. Yeah, people in the history of the world have been kept from certain economic abilities depending on their group status, within a group and then between groups. So there is that kind of conflict. I mean, I'm thinking that maybe this is one of the better times in world history to live. If you were to say, I want to live at a time in world history from the beginning to the present, not some pretend future, but from the beginning to the present, which is the most economically equitable, with the most opportunities economically, I think you're probably looking at it. You'll have to look around and see if there's some other better ones, some competitors, because then might be sacrificing other things, right? Like medical health. So you might say, oh, this time was better and people are living to be 30. So say, well, the present time's a little better. You can make it into your 80s and have these opportunities. Or you might pick a country in the world and say, what's the land with the most opportunities that people everywhere want to go to that place if they can? And why? What are these opportunities? Again, if we've just looked at them as economic, we've already missed it. Our lives will be empty. We'll have economic and political opportunities, and we won't even know what is good. We'll be like the persons that Socrates questioned in the Apology. Politicians, artists, craftsmen, and could be very successful, and we don't even know what is wise. So number 4 here seems to be misdirected. Concern about strife. How about being concerned about the good? I'm concerned I don't have what is good. And then he says, we have a better critique than you do of racial capitalism. I'm not sure how you can, for 2 reasons. Critique requires the use of reason. You're using reason to form a critique about the other person's understanding of the good. But you've turned it into just economics. So that isn't a better critique. And then suggesting that people should get on his critique instead of bellyaching about their own freedoms. And why not bellyache about them? Because you've used them to great harm. And I don't know that he's wrong there. Indeed, he might be more right than he is wrong, but accidentally. What I mean is the things he's thinking of are great harm. He hasn't connected to the good. Great harm economically, great harm militarily, politically. But what about the good? Great harm in preventing others from achieving the good. I'd be on board with that critique. I would. If you were to say, you in the West haven't identified the good as the knowledge of God revealed through the works of God. You haven't shown how it's easily available and how the failure to know is without excuse. And that without excuse means that humans are in need of redemption, and that redemption is only through Christ. You haven't shown that. You've put other things in its place. You've put heaven. You've told people to believe in Jesus to go to heaven in the next life. You told people to believe in God because then you'd get blessings in this life, material, economic blessings. So yeah, I'd be on board with that critique. You've allowed skepticism to persist. It's not clear if God is real. And fideism to persist. Just believe it and you'll have a good afterlife. And you haven't shown it's clear to reason that God exists. You've caused great harm in not having done that. He's right about that, although I don't know he's getting to that great harm. Now, what is it to be committed? From that same talk, what is it to be committed to decolonizing in this space, classics? Is demanding an unthinking and undueling of some of the discipline's core tenets, constitutive of the foundations of which I'll name 3. The discipline's description and value of itself within a white supremacist framework, with implicit and explicit denigrations of other disciplinary modes and practices in the process. Now, I don't know enough about classics. I mean, I have studied classical works at secular universities my whole career. I haven't encountered this. And they might just say, well, you don't see it because it's like a fish doesn't know he's wet. You're just in it so much you don't realize it. But I'm pretty sure I can show I've learned the opposite from reading the classics, the opposite of white supremacists. So what might happen is they could pick out a white supremacist somewhere who has a speech and he says, we should read the great books of Western civilization because they prove white supremacy. Well, I mean, yeah, you can find a fool who will say anything. That doesn't harm Hamlet just because some guy somewhere thought that if you read Hamlet, you'll join his club. Hamlet is still Hamlet, and you can't impugn the greatness in Hamlet because of how some guy misused it. Second is the discipline's institutionalization in the global north as a medium for an incubator for white supremacy in lockstep with the intensification of the transatlantic slave trades, Euro-American settler colonialism, and the rise and consolidation of racial capitalism. The discipline, from its roots, is wired through these circuits of domination. There is no way to do a responsible disciplinary history that doesn't acknowledge this. Okay, so that the discipline of classics is rooted in the same institutionalization that led to the slave trade and the Euro-American settler colonialism, which would also then be involved in, say, conflicts with Native Americans. Now, what's the connection there? Is he saying that there's a causal link, that by reading the Iliad, people that caused slavery? What's the cause of slavery? What's the cause of conflicts between people groups, like in Native Americans and settlers? That's a little different than slavery, right? That is more like war, and one side won and the other side lost. And then there's a slave trade where you'd have groups in Africa at war with each other, selling each other to the slave traders, who then transport them across the Atlantic to the Caribbean or to North America. Why are there these conflicts and tensions? There's no doubt that those are real, but I'm trying to figure out what the causal relationship is. Is it just that it's going on at the same time? Lots of people read the Iliad and didn't become slave traders. And there are people within that tradition who argued against the slave trade. Think about today with the practice of abortion. And in the future, people will look back and say, look at how they, just how they look back now and they say, look how they treated slaves. Look how they treated their children. How could they not see that? But that would be overlooking an intense battle that goes on in America between people who are for abortion and people who want to stop abortion. So you couldn't just say the whole group was pro-slavery or the whole group is pro-abortion. And again, that still doesn't get us to what the causal link is between classics and that. How are they implicated? What is their disciplinary institutionalization? Here's what I'd read them as, saying a little bit differently. There's a foundation that's flawed, a foundation out of which came fruits that are wicked. It's not enough to end the fruits. You have to go back to the foundation. Here you might say, wait, you're mixing your metaphors. One, you have a house and you have a plant. Pick one. Right? You have to go back to the roots of the plant, which is the foundation of the plant, and correct it. It has to be a whole new one. You can't just put some cement over the crack of the foundation. It just still cracks. It is the crack in the foundation is part of the structure of it. We need a new foundation. Let me put that down here. He sees that the foundation is flawed, cannot simply be patched, must be replaced. I went up there. A critique requires reason. Yeah, and down here. True. We haven't taught what is good. We haven't taught that the good is the knowledge of God, which is available through the works of God. We haven't shown that unbelief is without excuse. We haven't shown that unbelief requires redemption. We haven't shown that this redemption is through Christ alone, and that the goal of redemption is the earth being filled, I'll have to go back and correct these, filled with the knowledge of God as the waters cover the sea. We have instead pushed skepticism and fideism with its otherworldliness, or I should say with this worldliness and otherworldliness. All right, so that's what we'd gone over. I should have typed that down for us. And then same thing down here. He sees that there's a foundation that's broken and must be replaced. And then finally, the third one, I'll note internalized discourse of crisis and imminent decline of assault from the outside that has become fetishistic within classics itself. And this is a discourse that conceals forms of social I wonder if it was exploitation and domination in which the discipline is complicit. Complicit, but which it bears no blame to itself. So there's a kind of declension narrative that's told. Things are getting worse and worse by the classicists. So no one even knows who Homer is. They think he's a Simpson. No one knows who Hamlet is. And you have this lamenting about the decline of education. But they don't see the decline in education they lament is their own fault. Why? Well, they haven't made knowledge available. For all the classics that they love to read, many of which include discussions of the good, they haven't educated their students about the good. Uh-oh. Got a problem. Let's keep going. The work of decolonizing is not and cannot, never could be, about accumulating persons from groups historically underrepresented at predominantly white institutions for show and tell. It is about interrogating and, in many cases, demolishing long standing hierarchies and building back up to a knowledge practice that is inhabiting forms of knowledge that is not just flexible, capacious, and equitable, but redistributive. That is the name of the game. Man, direct. I love it when people are just direct and they don't hide their intentions. Redistribution. That's the name of the game. And it's interesting. He means economics, but he includes epistemology. Redistributing knowledge of a certain kind allows for redistribution economically. So it's not just about infusing diversity. So it's not simply diversity. It is a whole new foundation. Justice requires distribution, but in this case, no knowledge is being distributed. No one can show us from reason what is good for human nature. So the distribution is zero. He's thinking of economically, of course, but also epistemologically. So he wants there to be epistemological distribution of knowledge. We must distribute knowledge by showing what is clear to reason. Good. And then this is a bit of a longer one. Then I have a quote from Du Bois. Key moves. These are the key moves he says we need to do in our field discipline. Critical reordering of the discipline's ideological commitments. That begins with the name. A deprovidentialization of specific disciplinary practices that have historically colluded with and to the present day remain in hoc to, should put commas here, the material forms of subjection has to take stock of the name classics. So how you name things is important. The naming of something, and if something's mistaken, it requires a renaming. It also has to take stock around which the discipline has coalesced. What has the discipline coalesced around? I'll name one technology. When he says all, it means him, not me. I'll name one technology for the purpose of illustration. This is the practice of philology, as enshrined in the history of textual criticism and textual transmission. This is a practice that evolves together with race science, as scholars have pointed out. And you can go back in science 100 years and you can see he's not wrong. The scientists had all kinds of views of what race was, which we would today call racist, and led to things like the practices we saw in Germany in World War II. So those have been addressed. But what about other fields that haven't been addressed? This is practice that evolves together with race science, as scholars have pointed out, and in order to do the work of decolonization and decolonizing philology, we would have to honor, here he gives a name, I'm not sure I got the name right from the audio, and I haven't looked it up. So honor a thinker he mentions, in which, among other arguments, he states that the first move we can make towards truth is to abandon the pretense of pure philology that has been so central to the field. I do not say abandon the pursuit of language proficiency, and he's proficient in language. As I said, he gave his speech in Latin. What I said is that a pure philology unmixed with contemporary realities is a pretense and a pernicious lie. So let me put that down here as we're going. Pure philology is like saying experience without interpretation. No experience is meaningful without interpretation. So he's calling our attention to that. Further to this point, we have to honor and make space for the integration of those practices in critical race studies and indigenous studies whose high-level granularity documents the connivance of disciplinary formations with hegemonic structures. Here is not only a matter of reading Black writers and indigenous writers, it is a matter of whose scholarship counts as scholarship in a field. Whose scholarship is to say, what is knowledge? We don't know. And we don't know. Don't have an answer for that. Don't know. Don't have knowledge. They're skeptics. They don't know what the good is. This requires doing critical genealogies. So you can trace the family trees of knowledge claimed. We do that in philosophy. You trace the continental stream, the analytic stream, the Kantian, the neo-Kantian, all of this stuff. So yeah, people do that. It doesn't actually help us get to arguments though, because it could become the genetic fallacy. This is true because so-and-so said it, or this is false because so-and-so said it. The other important aspect of this is that, especially as teaching and writing about subjects such as classical reception, we have to resist the allure of happy face classics. What does it mean by that? There's a tendency to showcase the acts of receiving and negotiating. We listen to this part. Negotiating traditions that were previously demarcated and delineated as Euro-American Western ones, as the kinds of traditions that folks of color can see themselves as acting interlocutors. So you'll see classes set up where they have Antigone and the reception of Antigone in Africa, or the African diaspora, or in Caribbean context, or in North America. And these modes of reception are being presented as a way of duping folks into their own subjection. This is something we must avoid at all costs. So again, it's not just enough to have diversity or to say, how was this classic understood in another place? That's treating the other place as subjected to your classic. So not sufficient. These actions serve to reify the hegemony of a predominantly white culture, but also because they prohibit the work of epistemic justice. Remember, I mentioned that epistemic justice, not economic. That is necessary for radical emancipatory project of seeing through decolonizing successfully. So to see through decolonizing, there must be epistemic justice, knowledge, not skepticism or fideism. All right. This also means that we have to model the fact that disciplinary methods that stress the bad as well as the I think he said notionally good. Yeah, notionally good aren't deleterious to the discipline's future prospects, because it is only in recognition and surrender of institutionalized privilege that something like a classics reconstituted would have a meaningful 21st century discipline. This means we have to entertain seriously that we might need to let the discipline die. So you might just need to let it go. It isn't reformable. The foundation is so broken that you can't remake it. You just need to start over. And it's interesting. He says the stress the bad as well as the notionally good. He still doesn't have a definition for us of what is good. What does it mean for something to be good exactly? How can we show what that is? Then only then, let me put that here. We must know what is good, not just notionally good, if we are to critique the discipline and the foundation. So I'm taking a lot of what he said, putting it into a foundation critique that he's not even able to articulate yet, because he is focused on the strife between people economically and politically. I'm trying to work that back around and say, look, what we really need to do if we want to meaningfully and lastingly address those things is get back to this foundation. That's where we've gone astray into teaching skepticism and visworldliness, which he might be caught up in, or fideism and otherworldliness. And we haven't taught the good as the knowledge of God through the works of God, with the goal of the earth being filled with the knowledge of God as waters cover the sea. Now, I saw this quote from Du Bois, and he says this: I sit with Shakespeare, and he winces not. Across the color line I move arm in arm with Balzac and Dumas, where smiling men and welcoming women glide in gilded halls. From out of the caves of evening that swing between the strong-limbed earth and the tracery of stars, I summon Aristotle and Aurelius, and what soul I will, and they come all graciously with no scorn nor condescension. So, wed with truth, I dwell above the veil. Is this the life you grudge us, O knightly America? Is this the life you long to change into the dull red hideousness of Georgia? Are you so afraid lest peering from this high Pisgah between Philistine and Amalekite, we sight the promised land? Ooh, I like this for a number of reasons. How is the good being taught to others? Can you keep it to yourself? Can you keep Shakespeare to yourself? Once the others, whoever they are, here let's say it's Philistine, learn to read Shakespeare, Shakespeare is universal. It's for everybody, or he is for everybody. The plays are for everybody. You can't say, no, this one's mine. You can't have it unless you just don't print it. But I mean, in terms of the ideas, as soon as they get hold of it. And truth is for everybody. Du Bois is talking from a time where there was still this idea of objective truth. What we're being called to here is to see how interpretation plays a part. Skeptics maybe made bold assertions to the truth and they didn't have knowledge. And so we're being reminded, no, that's just your interpretation. You need to show from reason that your interpretation is coherent. We don't want to get caught between that false dichotomy. But I think this quote here is giving us something. If you complain about the Philistine and the Amalekite, had you presented them with the gospel? Now that's a kind of New Testament being applied to Old Testament. But think about the light that Israel had. Had it been presented? What is this promised land? Not knowledge simpliciter, like here's an encyclopedia. There's a lot of good stuff in it. Knowledge of the works of God, which include creation and redemption. The promise of redemption. Had you taught that? Maybe you asserted some version of it, which wasn't quite right. And the people said, I don't want that. I want knowledge. So Du Bois here, I think, speaks to seeing that knowledge, that universal truth, and you can't stop it. You want it. Here we're seeing the wrestling with the frustration of the consequences of not having had it, of being given fideism, and the economic and political outcomes of that. But at the basic, calling for epistemic justice. And epistemic justice, something I can get behind, it means presenting people with knowledge, not skepticism, not fideism. Here's how you can know what is clear to reason about God and the good, starting with myself. Here's how I can know it. So we're taking that from this discussion of decolonizing the curriculum. Thanks for joining me.